Hi, and welcome to the Killen Report. I'm Jonathan Kleid. We have a very special guest today, and I'm excited that he is here. He is Pat Burt. He's the Vice Mayor of Palo Alto. He's also a board member of the Santa Clara Valley Transit Authority. He's also on the San Francisco Creek Joint Power Authority, and finally, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. That's a lot to say. So I'd like to welcome him. Pat, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We've got a lot to talk about, and I'm really excited because you're the person to talk about it with. Today, I want to talk with you about the rising sea level and also the mega fires that are becoming more and more familiar to Northern Californians and Californians in general.
Well, we have for several years been including the anticipated and projected level of sea level rise in a whole bunch of long-term policies and programs for the city and regional bodies that we're a part of. For instance, the San Francisco Creek Joint Power Authority finished a flood control project for essentially downstream of 101 that protected much of East Palo Alto that was at dire threat from flooding from the creek that divides our two counties. And we were one of the first agencies and first projects in the country to include a projection of a 100-year flood protection with anticipation of sea level rise. And we basically looked at the sea level rise for through 2050, and we had to do that as a range because there's so much uncertainty today. And but the city has also looked at, like cities throughout the Bay Area, much of our lands were either on a bay fill or on what was once the edge of tidal marsh. And so we now have a whole contingency planning on what areas that are threatened by future sea level rise we should try to protect through additional levees, and what are the more environmentally benign levee systems, what things should we begin to say we shouldn't be allowing future development, or even that we should be rescinding at some point in time development in those areas. So it's a grave risk. We've also come to realize that when sea level rise occurs, it actually impacts our freshwater groundwater system and drives it more to the surface. And that's another anticipation that we're just beginning to contend with.
I see. Well, you know, when we talk about sea level rise, one of the things that comes to mind that's very much in the news, and perhaps you could speak to this also, is how the Arctic ice that is melting and disappearing is playing a part on what you've just talked about.
Well, the Arctic ice and Greenland glacier melting are probably the two biggest drivers of sea level rise, and they are both happening at very rapid rates. More rapid than was hoped for just a few years ago. We thought we might have more time to respond to climate change than we now appear to. So those are huge drivers.
So let me ask you, since you had mentioned that Palo Alto is developing a plan and has contingencies, can you be a little bit more specific in terms of that plan and how it will avoid, harm that could come as we're seeing this sea level rise?
Yeah, I think the most we can do is try to mitigate the harm, not eliminate it. It's going to happen. Part of the issue is that the levees around the bay, many of them were not designed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're really inadequate. and they were inadequate for our current conditions, but they're very inadequate as we experience sea level rise. It's important to realize too that it's not just this sea level rise that happens gradually. When we have risks of flooding at the bay, it is often because we have an event at the same time that is a storm, which could have severe water flowing down our streams and rivers that merges with the bay. That same storm causes storm surges. This is what we saw with Katrina, where the biggest impact was the storm surge, not the flooding and not the hurricane itself. Literally, the ocean gets pushed up into the bay, and that combines with the sea level rise, with the flow into our streams and rivers, and potentially, if the timing's wrong, with a high tide. So it's a convergence of events that is our worst case scenario, and that's what we're having to plan for. So around the bay, there is now an initiative, early stages, to look comprehensively at all the threats to low-lying areas. And you think about Silicon Valley and its tech community and where Facebook is located and Google is located, and trillions of dollars of companies are actually in those bay fill areas in jeopardy.
That's actually an excellent point. And having been, I know that you're vice mayor now, but you were the mayor of Palo Alto, American city. So from your point of view, having held that position, what should mayors across the country that are in similar positions and sea level areas, what should they be doing?
I think two things. One is they have to have climate adaptation plans for the certainty that we're going to have significant climate change and the uncertainty about how severe that will be. Second, we need to act collectively to take the climate protection actions that will try to reduce the impacts of climate change, to get our greenhouse gases emissions under control, and to begin to even draw down those so that we can have a stability in our climate, which is still possible. We're headed down a bad path, but we still have it within our means to be able to respond and do so in an aggressive way. And I will say that that pandemic has really exhibited that up until the pandemic, there was really a consensus that we knew what we had to do, and there was no way we could get the societal change and the financial resources necessary to put the brakes on climate change. And the pandemic has shown us that we can make massive societal changes, spend trillions of dollars, and I think the Biden administration is really pivoting and moving toward trying to prevent the next global catastrophe that could be far greater, or likely would be far greater than the COVID pandemic.
Well, since you mentioned the greenhouse gases, and since you also mentioned the Biden administration, tell me, how important is the Biden administration's electric vehicle plans?
Well, the EV plan itself is extremely important, and his more comprehensive plan on climate change is even more important. The EV is probably the biggest proportion. When we look at what makes up the greenhouse gas emissions, we have one bucket of our energy generation. Palo Alto was one of the first cities globally to achieve a carbon neutral electricity supply back in 2014 and 2015. So now we've taken that part out of our greenhouse gas equation. The balance is, how do we electrify with clean energy our transportation system and then our buildings? And that's not just the materials or the energy we consume in our buildings, it's all the materials that we use to construct our buildings and related matters. But the buildings and the transportation are the two remaining buckets once we've made our energy system of our electricity supply carbon neutral, or better yet, carbon free.
So we've talked about the rise in sea level. We've talked about the importance of ridding ourselves of greenhouse gas. We've talked about EVs. What keeps you up at night?
Actually, what now keeps me up, in addition to anything else it did before, is the severe threat of mega fires in California. We thought that sea level rise was the most likely and severe climate impact that we would face in our communities and in our state. We've now had 5 years of record-setting mega fires like we've never seen before. 5 of the 6 biggest fires in California history were just last summer. And what we have? We have entire communities that are getting burnt out, and climate refugees, and thousands of people in California, even in our backyard in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We were a wind shift away from last year's mega fire sweeping down into our foothills and our wildland urban interface, it's called, essentially into our city. Like we had Paradise and Boulder Creek and Santa Rosa, where entire communities have been wiped out. On top of that, so that's the public safety risk. We have a public health risk where we have everybody in the state breathing highly unhealthy, smoke-filled air for a month, a year now, and we don't even know how severe those long-term health impacts are. So that is now a present danger to us right as we speak today. Following a winter that has been a near record drought. We're a tinderbox in our hills.
So what's to be done?
Well, on that aspect, in addition to addressing the root cause, we need to have a much more comprehensive foothills fire protection plan that is prevention, detection and response, and even recovery. And I make the mention of recovery, so it's not only how do we prevent fires, how do we detect them early, how do we collaborate and respond, have the resources, but on our flood control agency, we've now begun to recognize that all of our modeling on the worst case scenario of flooding goes out the window if we have a mega fire and we no longer have all the forest protecting and absorbing the rainfall, and instead the rainfall just shoots downhill. And we've seen what happens in flooding after major fires. So we have even that to mention.
I understand. Well, in the very, very little bit of time that we have left, just on a personal note, from your point of view, when you were mayor in Palo Alto, what do you feel was your most important environmental accomplishment in that position?
It was the completion of the carbon neutral electricity portfolio, which is the foundation for us now moving forward with our sustainability and climate action plan that set a goal of 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. And so by having a carbon neutral electricity, as we shift our cars and other transportation to electricity, as we shift our buildings from methane, natural gas, to electricity, that's the building block that we build off of. We have a clean energy supply, and we shift over to it from petroleum and from natural gas to clean electricity. That's the plan we're trying to achieve now.
Well, it's fantastic having you, Pat, and I hope that our viewers have learned as much as I have. You're terrific. Thank you. And that's it for this edition of the Killen Report. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.